The Xano database is a big part of the value proposition of why people, hire or get Xano, right? The idea is that you have this instance and these function stacks that are integrated with having this database, which we all know is a PostgreSQL database, which is a type of relational database that can just sort of store tables, and tables can have records. So in here, I could look at, say, this list of tables, and the tables and within a table, I can have these, structure, which are the fields within the table. It's like the columns, right, going across. And then I can have additional records or whatever that will contain data with them, and all sorts of different data types that are available to us. And the way that we usually interact with these is going to be using the the database request functions are available to us inside our Xano, right? Like the being able to query our records, get a whole bunch of things, or get record, or making edits, or whatever. But we all know that there's a database behind the scenes, and because there's a database, there's more than one way for us to access this information. In fact, there are certain plugins that, like I think the software plugin, that for Xano that allows us to get information out of the Xano database without going through the Xano function stack. And this can be important for, other, ways we're getting more leverage from our Xano. This can be important for administrative purposes, for being able to do easy backups, that kind of thing, and just being able to express control over the data so it's not just sitting inside our one instance. And so to do this, there's actually a feature within Xano that allows us to access that database under the covers, right? So rather than going through the function stack or going through the newer metadata API, there is an additional feature within Xano called the database connector. And that database connector is basically just, gives access to a username password combo that allows you to go talk to that database from outside of the Xano instance. And that then you can, get, go ask questions directly of the database from wherever by just sending SQL to it. Now, this will also uncover some weirdness in the way the Xano database is set up. But we today are going to take a look at the Xano database connector, how to get activated and how to, get some value out of it right away. So let's turn our attention back to our Xano function stack or Xano instance where we were looking at this database, and we can take a look at the dashboard and be able to see all the stuff going on. And this is with the extension, of course. And what we can do is go up a level because the workspace is not where we have our databases and or do we have our tables. Now I'm going to quickly note that inside these tables, we have a name, then we also have a number and a number and a number. And these numbers are going to be very important for us to remember as we're getting deeper into how these databases work. But for us to get access to the connector, we need to go up a level and we need to say, let's go take a look at our workspaces. And then from there, we need to go take a look at our instances. And this is where we can change up our billing and like what features our given instance has. So when you look at the billing, you're able to set up, what's going on with your particular instance, and you can, go from like launch to scale or whatever else. And this feature that we're talking about is exclusively for the Xano paid plans as well, because the Xano build plan, which is like the free tier, works completely differently than the paid ones do, and they don't actually have any of these features. But once you have your own instance, when you're paying either the launch or the scale level, you have the opportunity to get an upgrade, which is this database connector. You can just do that by clicking change plan in here and being able to, manage your add-ons, right? And here you'll be able to see that I have an add-on in here, which is the database connector, right, which I activated. And because I'm on annual billing, it's costing me, $300 a year to enable it, which is about $25 a month. I gotta say, as compared with the cost of the rest of the Xano plan, which is about $200 a month when I'm paying for the year, it's not that, $25 tax is, a little over 10%. It's not that big a deal. But it does unlock quite a bit of value. So let's step back here and then take a look at our instance. And once you've actually purchased this, you're going to have access to this little gear here. And inside the gear, you can click on where it says database connector. And this starts to give us the information necessary for us to go talk to our database. Now, I'm going to encourage a couple of things from a security point of view. The first is under these settings, this is where you can set up an allow list of IPs. And you don't necessarily want every Tom, Dick, and Harry going attacking your instance to find out whether or not you have the database connector activated and then start to try to log into it. By doing this, you can make sure that only of traffic from particular IPs on the internet will actually be allowed. Now, when you're trying to do this for yourself, I would actually recommend doing something like, what's my IP? And there are services out there that will just tell you what your IP address is from the point of view of the outside world. You can highlight this and then, go back over to your Xano and add that in. Now, later on, when you have like a third-party server or service or something, you probably want to add that as well. And initially, it's probably okay to not set this, but I recommend doing that as a way to handle real lockdown, because this is unhackable, right? There's no way they can get around it by figuring out your password. They're not even allowed to check the password if they're not coming from the correct IP address. So I can say save here, and that will just make sure that only I and nobody else will be able to make that kind of communication. And if I click back into the database connector, and I can now see what the IP address of the database is, which shouldn't be that surprising because the database IP is going to be the IP of your instance. The situation which is not going to be exactly the same as your instance could be when you have some Xano clustering going on, but that tends to only happen at high levels of Xano, like when you're using auto scaling and stuff. But for most of us in the launch or ordinary scale plans, you're going to find that this IP address is exactly the same as the IP address of your Xano instance. So with that out of the way, the real interesting question is going to be your database credentials, which you can click Get here. Of import is I'm going to show you some database credentials, but those database credentials aren't going to do you any good. And the reason they're not going to do you any good is because I can, and I will at the end of this meeting, revoke and regenerate them. But here you can see how it's set up with a username, a password, right? The host, which is exactly what we were just looking at before, and a database, which will also become important in just a minute. So what you're going to want to do is use a client for talking to PostgreSQL. There are a bunch of good clients out there, and you can go surfing around. But I've actually been doing a lot of my exploration using something called DBeaver, which is a newish GUI that runs locally in your Windows, Mac, or Linux environments. And I'm running on macOS right now. And so I can just download it for Apple Silicon. It gives me a DMG that will just let me copy it right into applications. Now, I've already downloaded it and put it into my system. So I'm just going to click on my launchpad and click DBE. And there it is, DBeaver, and just open this up. Note that this is the Community Edition, which is free and probably has everything you really want at the outset. Although they have a pro version as well that has some has additional functionality that seems like some pretty cool stuff. Maybe one wants to check it out. So I will say, that's fine, and close it up. Okay. Now, when we're in here, we're going to need to set up a new connection to the system, and everything's sort of hidden. You can see here it says new database connection. We can click on that, and we will open up PostgreSQL, which is the big blue elephant. You're going to find the elephant shows up a lot for all these PostgreSQL things. And here is where we need to set up the connection to the database. We need the host and the database and the username and the password. And if we go over to our database connector in Xano, right here we are, we have a user. Now, we can pick which user we're going to use. I'm going to use the full user to demonstrate a wider range of functionality, but you have both full and you have read. The read is going to be particularly useful for something like the software integration, which is, pulling down your, lists of stuff and turning your database into a site. And when you just want people to access the information, but you don't want people to make changes to it. Full is read and write access, and that's what I'm going to demonstrate today. So I'm going to grab the full username, and we go back over to our friends at DBeaver, and I'm going to say username is paste, and then I'm going to click the password. The password is always going to look like this sort of hexadecimal notation. The password. And where is the host? Copy that. The host is here. So I'm just doing it by IP address. And the database is here. And the database I can do here. Now, as a matter of interest, I'm going to tell it to show all databases, because when you have access to full, it's actually giving you access to both this database as well as another database that shows up in all PostgreSQL instances, which is called Postgres. But there's not more than you need to worry about with this. Like, this is just, using database native authentication, nothing else very special about it. And you're off to the races. So you can just click finish, right? And then we can open it up. It says loading, and we have a few things in here, including databases. Note that the database Postgres is less interesting. because it's going to contain information basically about how the whole database is set up, and the arrangement of other databases. But there's only one interesting database in your classic Xano instance, which is going to be the ones called Xano dash whatever, whatever, whatever. You'll probably recognize the whatever, whatever, whatever as being the same as the name of your Xano instance. And if you don't have like, custom naming. For example, mine is API State Change AI, which is, that's a custom name that I put on top of it, but the original name would still look like these bits in here. So I can open up the most interesting parts in here. There's some stuff you can go goof around with, but the most interesting parts here are in schemas and public. And inside public, you have two big sections that are going to be of importance. The first one is called tables. Tables are the actual places where data is stored. So we've talked before about tables, fields, and records, and rows, and you have all sorts of information in here, which is actually kind of cool because you can run direct requests on all this stuff, which is pretty neat. We can say, let's go generate some SQL on it, and we can say select, and you can see that it will create some SQL that works with it. And you'll notice it shows ID, create, update at XDO. Wait, that doesn't seem like a lot of information. And that actually gets kind of neat, So let's copy this for a second, and then we're going to say let's make a new SQL. And by clicking here, it just creates a little SQL board, and the rest is only going to be very interesting if you actually know a little bit of SQL, which is SQL, the structured query language, and you can go get all the information in MVB request. And I'm just going to say limit 10 so we don't get all the information on the planet. And I can press this little play button up here, which says, which will execute that SQL script. And this will bring down the information, showing it to me in the kind of tabular form that you're probably familiar with if you've worked in the Xano database preview environment. However, it doesn't look like the Xano database preview environment. You're going to find these all have IDs, and these all have these XDOs. And these XDOs are important because this is called a JSON B field. And in fact, if we were to open up the columns, you'll see here, there's a JSON B field, this XDO. This shows up all the time in Xano. You're going to find an MVP process, columns. Hey, look, there's an XDO. This is just the way Xano is set up. So Xano is basically set up in a semi-document structure where you have your ID, which is the primary key. You have a couple of housekeeping fields, maybe. And then you have what they call XDO, which is which is going to be a JSON blob that holds all the other information about the table. So basically, everything you think of as being a column in the table isn't really a column in the table. They do get turned to columns, what are called views. We'll look at those in just a minute. But basically, everything in here you can see as being, a big old piece of JSON. And you can sort of look inside what each of these keys are, right? You have a log, and then the log contains, text or an array in this case, which actually seems like exactly what's going on here. And this is going to be for the request history. And then, some of these are for housekeeping. Some of these are larger than others, which are of interest, right? Like this is, the query log, which again, you'll notice doesn't tell you anything about what's in it. So I can just do MVB query. And this becomes like, I think one of the big values of Game Database Center is just being able to look around at how Xano is working under the covers and being able to see more of the information that's been going on inside each of these, queries and structures that they've got. Okay, well, and the queries, by the way, those are all definitions of the API queries and and the way that they work on the inside, and you can sort of get more into what's inside there. But while those are the housekeeping ones, then they show MVP underscore, MVP underscore, MVP underscore, and then they drop the underscore part, right? You see MVPW 19 underscore 100 and 101, 102, 103, 104, et cetera. Now, the reason why these are important is that these represent the database. These are the individual tables that are sitting inside your Xano environment. Remember I told you to look at those numbers associated with the tables? Well, this is the workspace ID, and this is the number of the table. So if I go back over to my Xano, for example, and I say, you know what, don't worry about this stuff. And I say, let's click into the instance. And from the instance, I click into one of my workspaces. And from the workspace, I click in the database. And from the database, I'm going to just take a look at, I don't know, like a particular, one of the contracts from like a project I was working on that was a crypto related thing. Fine. You'll notice it shows the number 16, but it's also associated with workspace number 1. So HS contracts is actually number 16. So the way that we make use of that in here is we say MVPW, these are all 19, 1 underscore 16, right? So if I could say, MVP W1 underscore 16, you'll notice it says actually these two columns don't exist. The tool is actually kind of helpful for that because it identifies this actually as 2 columns. Because it's created at and updated at are actually, from the point of view of the user tables, all sitting inside XDO because they're things that you have control over. And, when we look at this, we sort of get a better understanding of why it is Xano says we can't update the ID field or rename it or whatever. It's because it's not inside the XDO field. The XDO field is where the user has control. That's where they sort of, goof around and mutate things. Whereas the ID field is completely outside and is not something that the user has direct control over. This also explains some quirks in terms of the performance of Xano, where the Xano table under covers, every time we request a record from one of these tables, we're getting, we can't actually limit the fields we're getting back, right? We're actually looking through this entire XDO blob. So if the XDO blob has a lot of data in it on a per record basis, that's actually going to slow us down. And I've certainly seen that in the past when I start to add more data. Like even though I'm not selecting from the field, right, which is the item within the XDO, I've noticed that it seems to be slowed down by the presence of more data. And the reason for that is because it still has to sift through all this stuff because it's not using the primary PostgreSQL field separation when you're setting up your tables, right? It's all just these elements that are sitting inside this little XDO thing. Which is actually kind of interesting to me because it sets up Xano, if they wanted to become more of a document database as well. But they haven't really gone down that road yet. Instead, they use the views. So this is the way the data is actually stored in Xano, the ID and the XDO. But it's not the way that you would usually interact with the data in Xano. Usually you were seeing those columns or whatever, right? And that's not just happening at the code level, that's actually happening in the database as well. Because if I were to go up here, I said there are 2 things that are of interest. One was the table and the other is the views. The views are where we can scroll down to, go take a look at, that same thing, 1 underscore 16, which I was alluding to before. 1 underscore the HS contracts. Now, these views are basically aliases of a table. So if I wanted to, I could, view the view, which that's a great way of putting it. And I can take a look at source. And the views are basically like, downstream representations of of SQL, right? So they ran SQL on the original table and converted all of the stuff that it found inside the table into these individual columns. Now, what this does, which is kind of neat, is if I were to, go back over to, here, right? I could say, well, let's take a look at x1 underscore 16. And by the way, this x1 underscore 16 is probably something you're going to find kind of familiar if you were to open up the database requests and go to direct database query, right? Because if I were to say use the wizard panel and show me all of the HS contracts, right? And see x1 underscore 16, which is exactly what we're looking at right now. So it's so the direct database query is actually using the views under the covers. Let's see, x1 underscore 16 instead, right? So now I can say, now it's not showing me x1 ID, XDO. I can say select star, right? And now, look, this looks so much more like what we would have in the database view inside Xano, right? Because now it goes from looking like a series of, the XDO thing, which just looks like a big old document, to having the additional columns because it is downstream of having extracted all of this stuff using the view creation process. And now we can sort of imagine how Xano is kind of trying to cache build those views, get a little more performance out of it, but keeping things actually in the XDO, which also explains why you can't update, because this is a view, and because the view isn't tied to directly to the underlying columns, a thing I can't do is update, right? So if I want to say update, right, and this would be a perfectly valid SQL, right? Update x116, set chain ID equals, let's see, 8002, right? So this, looking at this, seems like a perfectly valid SQL that I could run, right? Because there's a column here and whatever. And if I tried to do this, when I said, okay, now run this, and then I said, please run that, it'll tell me that chain ID doesn't exist. The reason why this is never going to work is that the chain ID is associated with the view. Because x116 is not table, it's a view. This table here, doesn't actually exist because it's actually part of this. When we understand that, we can understand the difference between how we read from the database and how we write to the database when we're working within this. And now we have more options where we can say that now we want to read whatever we want to read from it, and we're going to write using updates not to the view, but to the table. And I think that in general, that's a pretty good rule of thumb. You want to read from the view and you want to write to the table. So let's talk about how we do that. So so here we have all of our views, and all these views are read-only, as we've already established. Like what I want to do is I want to take the chain ID, right, for line 6, and I want to modify it. What would it? And here I would probably go to the table, it goes underneath it, which is going to be the table 1_16, right? Many more of these to find. Oh, and by the way, the test data set, you usually have a production data source, you have a test data source, you're allowed to set up more. We will have in here, and I think 19 has a bunch of them. You'll find that there's _test_ to be getting the versions of these that are actually for your test data sources, because those are actually different tables underneath the covers. So here we go to the database, and we have an ID and we have an XDO. So if I were to say, well, what I really want to do is I want to update, MVPW 116, right? And to do that, we do a set, right? But set what? Like we have an XDO field here. How do we update the XDO field? There are a couple ways of doing it, but like the way I like to do it is to use JSON b set. And to do that, we pass the original, we set XDO equals, right? So we're going to update XDO to this new value. And using JSON b set, we're going to set, we pass the original field. We tell it what path. So we should say where ID equals 6. Now it says it modified one thing. All right. So let's cut that, save. And now we're going to take a look at the view that's based on that same table. And we're going to go to 6, press play, and look at this, 8002. So this becomes the way that you can update tables alongside being able to get data from them. Easiest way is to get data from the view, although you can't always get it directly from the XDO. But whenever you write, you need to update the XDO to be setting the path that you're really looking for. And if this feels like it's a bit of a long way around, this starts to also explain some of the points at which you might have had, performance bottlenecks or opportunities within Xano. I find the more we understand the mental model of the technology we use, the more opportunity we have to really put it to work. Like this kind of XDO means it's much more extensible. It's a flexible system. It works a lot better with a lot of little fields than having really, really big fields. Like I tried to store large documents in, and I was wondering why it was taking forever for the thing to query. And the reason is, even though I was saying, please exclude these columns, the fact that all the columns are sitting inside this one XDO field was actually slowing it down. And that was sort of a remarkable insight for me. But this is how we can use the database connector for fun and profit. You can, all of this stuff that we've been doing here through DBeaver is something we can do using other tools, something you can do using like a Node or Python or PHP or whatever, a PostgreSQL library, as long as you know where to look. And then where to look is going to be inside the database that's specified in your connector. is going to be looking inside public and the public schema and largely reading from the views like X116 and writing to the tables. And then, yeah, everything after this is going to be some exploration and fun. So I'm going to wish you some happy hacking and, good luck on this. And hopefully this becomes a little bit less being your hardest 5%. I'll see you soon.